My husband stood under the spotlights at the Platinum Gala, raising a glass to a $5 billion merger that I built with my own hands. Instead of thanking me, he served me divorce papers and introduced his new fiancée to the world. He thought stripping me of my shares would destroy me, but he forgot that I hold the patent key. Without me, his luxury empire is nothing but a beautiful corpse. My name is Alara Vance, and at 32 years old, I was standing in the darkest corner of the Pierre Hotel ballroom, watching my life disintegrate under the weight of crystal chandeliers and $5,000 tuxedos. This was the Platinum Gala. The Night Thorn Energy was officially announcing its merger with Omnicorp. It was a deal worth $5 billion, a valuation built entirely on the battery technology I had spent the last 8 years developing in a windowless garage while my husband, Julian Thorne, practiced his golf swing and charmed venture capitalists. I smoothed the fabric of my navy blue dress, a garment I had worn to 3 consecutive Christmas parties. It was practical and unassuming, much like the role I played in the Thorne dynasty. Across the room, Julian stood in the center of a spotlight that seemed to follow him like a devoted pet. He looked magnificent. I had to admit, he was the golden boy of Manhattan, the charismatic CEO who promised a greener future. The investors surrounded him, laughing at jokes I knew he had rehearsed in front of the mirror that morning. I waited for him to wave me over. I waited for him to acknowledge the woman who had solved the thermal runaway issue that had nearly bankrupted us 2 years ago. Julian stepped up to the microphone, the room falling into a reverent silence. He spoke of vision, of courage, and of the future. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the acknowledgments, but my name never crossed his lips. Instead, he smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes and beckoned to someone standing in the front row. To lead a global empire, one needs a partner who understands power and legacy, Julian announced, his voice smooth as silk. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my future wife and the new vice president of communications, Serena Sterling. The applause was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as Serena, the daughter of a media tycoon, glided onto the stage in a shimmering silver gown that likely cost more than my parents' house. She kissed Julian, a flash of diamonds blinding me from across the room. The room spun. I was not just a spectator. I was being erased in real time. Before I could even process the betrayal, Julian descended the stage and walked straight to my table. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed, as if my presence was a stain on his perfect evening. He dropped a thick manila envelope onto the white tablecloth next to my untouched water glass. "Sign these tonight." "Alara," he said, his voice dropping to a cold whisper that only I could hear. "You are a brilliant engineer. I will give you that. But look at you. You are tedious. You lack vision. A CEO of a $5 billion conglomerate needs a queen, not a mechanic who smells like solder and desperation." I looked up, gasping for air, only to see his parents, Alistair and Victoria Thorne, looming behind him. Victoria looked me up and down with a sneer that could cut glass. "Oh, stop gaping, dear," she said, sipping her champagne. "We always said you were a lab rat. You were useful for the groundwork. But let us be honest, you do not have the constitution for royalty. Go back to your burrow." I stood up, my legs trembling. But before I could speak, 2 burly security guards materialized at my elbows. "Ms. Vance, you are causing a disturbance," one of them said. They grabbed my arms, not gently, and began to march me toward the exit. I looked around, desperate for a friendly face. I saw investors I had personally walked through technical schematics. I saw board members whose children I had tutored. They all looked away, sipping their drinks, complicit in my excision. I was shoved out of the revolving doors onto Fifth Avenue like a trespasser. The humid city air hit me like a physical blow. Humiliated and shaking, I hailed a taxi and gave the address of our penthouse on the Upper East Side. I needed to get my things. I needed to think. When I arrived, I bypassed the doorman who refused to meet my eyes and took the elevator up. I jammed my keycard into the slot. The light flashed red. Access denied. I tried again. Red. I pounded on the door, the heavy wood bruising my fists. My phone buzzed. It was Julian. Stop making a scene in the hallway. Alara, he said, his tone bored. I had the locks changed an hour ago. Your credit cards have been canceled. As for your personal effects, I had the maids pack your old clothes and send them to a storage unit in Queens. Everything else in that apartment was purchased with Thorn money, which makes it mine. You cannot do this, I whispered, my voice breaking. I built that company. I built you. You were an employee, Alara, and you have been terminated. The line went dead. I stood in the hallway. 8 years of my life, my genius, and my love reduced to nothing but a discarded asset. I had nothing but the dress on my back and the bitter realization that while I was building an engine, Julian had been building a cage. The silence of my old life was expensive, bought with soundproofing and high-altitude penthouse air. The soundtrack of my new life was free and relentless. It was the screech of the 7 train rattling the foundation of my building every 20 minutes, a mechanical earthquake that shook dust from the ceiling of my basement apartment in Queens. I had traded 3,000 square feet of marble for 300 square feet of peeling linoleum and a radiator that hissed like a dying snake. My fall from grace was not just social, it was professional and absolute. In the first week, I sent out 50 resumes to top engineering firms and energy startups. I was Alara Vance. I had patents to my name. I was the architect of the modern solid-state battery. Yet, every interview ended before it began. Doors that should have opened were slammed shut by the invisible hand of the Thorn family. Alistair Thorn had made good on his threat. I was blacklisted. To the energy sector. I was radioactive. To keep the lights on. I took the only job that did not ask questions. I became a night shift data entry clerk at a logistics company called Vortex Solutions. Every night from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, I sat in a cubicle farm bathed in flickering fluorescent light, typing shipping codes into a database from the 90s. My mind, which used to simulate complex electrochemical reactions, was now reduced to a machine for copying serial numbers. The monotony was a physical pain, a dull ache behind my eyes that reminded me of how much potential was rotting away in that chair. One night in the break room, the small television mounted in the corner broadcast my humiliation in high definition. The entertainment news showed grainy paparazzi footage of a yacht off the coast of the Maldives. There was Julian, shirtless and laughing, holding a glass of champagne while Serena applied sunscreen to his shoulders. The ticker at the bottom of the screen estimated the cost of their vacation at $50,000 a week. I stared at the screen, gripping my cup of lukewarm coffee. That yacht was powered by a hybrid engine system I had optimized. The champagne was bought with dividends from the stock price hike caused by my latest efficiency breakthrough. They were burning my genius as fuel for their paradise. The isolation deepened a few days later. I was walking to the subway station when I spotted David, a senior engineer at Thorn Energy whom I had mentored for 3 years. I had fought for his promotion when Julian wanted to fire him. I raised my hand to wave, a reflex from a past life. David looked right at me. He saw my frayed coat and the dark circles under my eyes. Then, he looked down at his phone and crossed the street, quickening his pace. I lowered my hand. I was not just poor. I was a contagion. Desperation forced my hand the following Tuesday. Rent was due, and my bank account was empty. I took off my wedding ring, a solitaire diamond that Julian had presented to me with a speech about how it represented his flawless love. I walked into a pawn shop on Jamaica Avenue, hoping for at least $5,000, enough to cover rent for a few months. The pawnbroker put a loupe to his eye, inspected it for 10 seconds, and tossed it onto the counter. "I can give you $200, he said flatly. I argued that it was insured for $20,000. He laughed and showed me the inclusions under the microscope. It was a low-grade stone, filled with imperfections, likely lab-grown in a discount facility. Julian had not just discarded me, He had never valued me to begin with. Even the symbol of our marriage was a counterfeit. I took the $200, feeling a hollowness in my chest that was far colder than the winter wind outside. That night, fueled by a mix of rage and insomnia, I began tearing through the few boxes of personal effects I had managed to salvage. I was looking for anything else to sell, but instead, my fingers brushed against the rough grain of a black leather notebook. I froze. It was from my days as a doctoral candidate at MIT. I opened it, the smell of old paper filling the stale air of the basement. The pages were covered in my frantic handwriting, diagrams, and equations. These were the embryonic stages of what became the Thorn battery system. I turned the pages until I landed on a section titled The Ether Protocol. This was the source code, the mathematical soul of the battery management system. I traced the ink with a trembling finger. Julian and his lawyers had been thorough in seizing the patents for the hardware and the final product, but as I stared at the complex derivation on page 42, a memory from a contract law elective resurfaced. A small, almost insignificant detail about intellectual property regarding pre-existing distinct works versus work for hire. They had the car, they had the engine, but looking at the notebook, I realized with a sudden, violent jolt of adrenaline that I had never officially transferred the keys. For 3 consecutive nights, I did not sleep. My basement apartment became a war room, the walls plastered with printouts of Thorn Energy's public patent filings. The coffee pot hissed in the corner, marking time as I cross-referenced every line of legal jargon against the faded ink in my black notebook. My eyes burned, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Julian's legal team was aggressive. I gave them that. They had successfully claimed the chemical composition of the battery cells and the physical architecture of the casing. They had locked down the body of the invention, but they had forgotten the soul. I discovered a glaring omission in paragraph 412 of the filing. To avoid revealing the proprietary trade secrets of the battery management system to competitors, the lawyers had listed the control algorithm as a pre-existing black box integration. They assumed that by owning the servers, they owned the software running on them. They were wrong. The Ether Protocol, the code that balanced the thermal load and prevented explosions, was not a static program. It was a dynamic, learning algorithm that required a biannual handshake from its creator to authorize updates. That creator was me. The system was protected by a biometric key linked to my retinal scan and a 24-character digital signature that existed only in my memory. I did the math on a napkin. Without the optimization patch from the source code, the batteries would function normally at low capacity. However, as soon as Thorn Energy scaled up production for the OmniCorp merger, the internal resistance would spike. I estimated they had exactly 6 months before every battery in their new fleet started overheating. It would not just be a failure, it would be a catastrophe. I needed a weapon to wield this truth, so I sought out Gideon Vale. Gideon was a legend in the legal underworld, a corporate shark who had been disbarred from the polite firms for his aggressive tactics and his public vendetta against the old money families of New York, specifically the Thorns. I found him in a chaotic office in Brooklyn that smelled of old books and expensive bourbon. He was buried under a mountain of case files, wearing a wrinkled linen suit. "I do not do pro bono work for charity cases," Gideon grumbled without looking up when I told him I had no money for a retainer. "Go find a legal aid clinic." "I do not want charity," I said, slamming my black notebook onto his desk. "I want to offer you the neck of Julian Thorn." Gideon paused. He looked at the notebook, then at me. I walked him through the patent omission and the biometric lock. I watched his expression shift from annoyance to curiosity, and finally, to a predatory grin. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "You are telling me that they are about to sell a $5 billion company that is effectively a ticking time bomb," Gideon said, his voice low and raspy. "And I am the only one who can defuse it," I replied. Gideon laughed, a dry, barking sound. "They are not just in debt to you, Ms. Vance," They are building a castle on sand where you control the tide. We spent the next 6 hours drafting a strategy. My instinct was to sue immediately, to scream the truth from the rooftops. Gideon stopped me. He argued that a lawsuit now would only give them time to scramble for a patch or settle for a small sum. We needed to wait. We needed to let the merger proceed, let the valuation balloon, and let Julian believe he was untouchable. We would strike only when the cost of failure was total annihilation. Walking out of his office, I felt a shift in my center of gravity. I was no longer the victim. On my way home, I stopped at a drugstore and bought a pair of sharp sewing scissors. Standing before the cracked mirror in my bathroom, I looked at the long, weary hair that Julian had always insisted I keep because it looked traditional. I took the scissors and hacked it off. Strands of brown hair fell into the sink. I shaped it into a sharp, angular bob that framed my jawline. I put on my one good blazer, applied a coat of dark red lipstick, and stared at the stranger in the reflection. She looked dangerous. As a final test, I sat down at my computer and routed my connection through 3 proxy servers. I sent a single anonymous email to the chief technical officer at Thorn Energy. It was a standard diagnostic warning, stating that the Ether protocol required a critical stability update within 180 days to prevent thermal runaway. I waited. 2 hours later, the read receipt flickered on. No reply came. They had deleted it. Their arrogance was absolute, and it would be their tomb. The silence from Thorn Energy did not last. As the $5 billion merger with Omnicorp entered the due diligence phase, the corporate auditors arrived with their microscopes. These were not just accountants, they were forensic engineers sent to stress test the assets. It took them exactly 3 days to find the ghost in the machine. They noticed the micro fluctuations in the battery output, the tiny instability that I knew would turn into a fire hazard within 6 months. They flagged the anomaly and demanded an explanation. Julian did not call to ask how I was. He did not call to apologize. He called my old number, which was now disconnected, and then furiously tracked me down through a private investigator. When the summons came, it wasn't a request, it was a demand for my immediate presence to fix the mess I had left behind. He was convinced I had planted a bug in the system before I left, a petty act of vandalism from a scorned wife. We met at Gideon Vale's office in Brooklyn. The setting was deliberate. Gideon's office was cluttered and smelled of stale coffee, a stark contrast to the glass and steel boardrooms Julian was used to. Julian swept in wearing a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than my annual rent, flanked by his personal attorney. He looked tired, but his arrogance was still intact, shielding him like armor. He didn't sit down. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a check, and slid it across the scarred oak desk toward me. $50,000, Julian said, his voice dripping with disdain. Consider it a consulting fee. You will come to the lab tonight, patch the code, and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I am being generous. Alara, take it and buy yourself a better apartment. I looked at the check. It was a lot of money for the woman who had been eating instant noodles for weeks, but it was pennies for the man about to close a $5 billion deal. I remained silent, folding my hands in my lap. Gideon leaned forward, his elbows resting on the piles of paper. You seem to be under a misconception, Mr. Thorne, Gideon said, his voice calm and level. Ms. Vance is not a disgruntled former employee you can pay off. She is the intellectual property owner of the Ether Protocol. Julian laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. That is ridiculous. Thorn Energy owns everything she created while under my roof. If she does not unlock that system, I will have her arrested for corporate sabotage and extortion. I will bury you in lawsuits until you rot in a cell. It is not sabotage, I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was steady, surprising even me. It is security. I slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a technical diagram of the Ether Protocol's authentication layer. The source code is not broken, Julian. It is locked. And it is not locked with a password you can crack or a key you can steal. It is encrypted with a real-time retinal scan. My retinal scan. The system requires a biometric handshake from the creator every 6 months to verify the integrity of the algorithm. Without my eyes scanning that terminal, the protocol assumes the system has been compromised and restricts power output to safe, useless levels. Julian picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the technical data, and I watched the blood drain from his face. He looked at his lawyer, who was frantically reading through a file, likely searching for the loophole I had found weeks ago. The lawyer looked up and gave a subtle, terrified shake of his head. They had nothing. Julian realized in that moment that he was trying to sell a Ferrari that had no engine keys, and I was the only one who could start it. The silence in the room stretched thin. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. When he looked back at me, the sneer was gone, replaced by a desperate calculation. $500,000, he said, his voice tighter this time. Cash, tax-free. I will have it wired to an offshore account of your choice within the hour. Just come and unlock it. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in my cheap blazer. I didn't look at the check. I looked him dead in the eye. You still do not understand, I said. My price is not measured in cash. Julian, it is measured in equity. I turned and walked out of the office, Gideon following close behind. As the door clicked shut, I heard the sound of glass shattering against the wall. Julian had thrown a vase. By the next morning, the war had shifted fronts. Since he could not buy me, Julian decided to destroy me. The headlines hit the tabloids first. Deranged ex-wife holds tech empire hostage, and the blackmail bride. He was painting me as a mentally unstable saboteur, a woman driven mad by jealousy who was trying to burn down his legacy. He thought public shame would break me. He was wrong. It only sharpened my focus. The tabloids called me the Black Widow of battery tech. The articles claimed I was unstable, a jealous ex-wife weaponizing computer code to extort a settlement from the benevolent Julian Thorne. They ran photos of me looking disheveled from the night I was thrown out of the gala, contrasted with Julian's airbrushed headshots where he looked like a weary saint tolerating a mad woman. The narrative was crafted by a crisis management firm that charged $5,000 an hour to destroy reputations. They spun a tale where Julian was the victim of a toxic marriage, a visionary held back by a spouse who could not understand his genius. The real-world consequences hit me 2 days later. I arrived at Vortex Solutions for my night shift only to find my keycard deactivated. The manager, a man who had praised my efficiency just a week prior, met me at the back door. He could not look me in the eye. He mumbled something about restructuring, but then he handed me a severance check for 2 weeks of pay and whispered that a major client had threatened to pull their contracts if I remained on the payroll. The Thorne influence was not just a ceiling, it was a wall closing in from all sides. I sat in Gideon's office, watching the smear campaign unfold on his laptop screen. Gideon poured 2 fingers of whiskey and slid the glass toward me. They are fighting a soap opera war, Gideon said, lighting a cigar. They want the world to talk about your emotions, your jealousy, your sanity. As long as the debate is about your character, you lose. We need to change the battlefield. We need to make this about the math. That night, we stopped defending myself. Instead, we went on the offensive. We did not leak emails or texts. We leaked physics. We uploaded a redacted version of the Ether Protocol's white paper to the most rigorous engineering forum on the internet. It was 50 pages of dense, complex thermodynamic equations and coding logic, stripped of trade secrets but undeniable in its sophistication. We titled it The Architecture of Stability in High-Density Cells and signed it simply as The Architect. The reaction was slow at first, but within 48 hours, the engineering community was ablaze. These were people who didn't care about gossip. They cared about elegance and design. They began analyzing the work, dissecting the brilliance of the thermal regulation algorithms. When they traced the syntax and the logic structure back to older academic papers I had published under my maiden name years ago, the connection was made. The internet detectives realized that the mad wife was actually the only person in the room who understood how the engine worked. The turning point came when I accepted an invitation to The Circuit, a tech podcast with 3 million listeners known for its deep dives into hard science. The host, a cynical former engineer, clearly expected me to use the platform to bash Julian. He asked about the divorce in his opening question. "I am not here to discuss my marriage," I said, my voice calm and steady through the microphone. "I am here to discuss the nonlinear degradation of lithium-ion cathodes under rapid charging cycles." For the next hour, I did not speak a single ill word about the Thorne family. I spoke about energy density, about the future of sustainable transport, and about the specific mathematical hurdles I had overcome to make the Ether protocol viable. I corrected the host on a formula. I laughed about the specific challenges of coding cooling systems. By the end of the hour, the host was looking at me with genuine awe. The episode went viral. The comment sections, usually a cesspool of toxicity, filled with engineers and tech enthusiasts praising my knowledge. The narrative cracked. People began to ask why the visionary Julian Thorne had never spoken about the technology with such depth. The hashtag #TheRealArchitect began trending on social media, pushing the tabloid stories off the front page. That evening, as I sat in my small kitchen reading the comments, a new email notification pinged on my laptop. It was not from a lawyer or a reporter. It was from a private server. "Mrs. Vance." The email read, "I have been listening to your interview. You are building the future, and I hate to see talent wasted on legal battles. My name is Marcus Kane. I would like to discuss financing your next project." I stared at the name. Marcus Kane was a venture capitalist known for backing the most disruptive companies of the last decade. Julian had tried to get a meeting with him for 5 years and failed. Now, he was in my inbox. The tide was turning, and for the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving. I was ready to build. Marcus Kane did not ask for a slide deck or a 5-year projection. He looked at the schematics I laid out on his glass coffee table, tapped the paper with his index finger, and wrote a check for $5 million as seed funding. That was the birth of Novus Kinetics. We did not lease a glass tower in Manhattan. Instead, we took over a defunct textile factory in the Navy Yard, a space of exposed brick and steel beams that smelled of salt water and hard work. My first act as CEO was to retrieve the casualties of Julian's arrogance. I pulled the termination records from Thorne Energy over the last 3 years and contacted every engineer who had been fired for raising safety concerns. These were men and women who had been labeled as difficult or insubordinate because they refused to sign off on flawed data. When I called them, many were working in IT support or teaching high school physics, their careers derailed by the Thorne blacklist. I offered them a chance to do the work they were born to do, without fear of retribution. They did not just accept the job offers, they flocked to the factory like it was a sanctuary. For 3 months, I worked 18 hours a day. I slept on a cot in the corner of my office and ate takeout with my team at 3 in the morning. The tabloids were still painting me as a bitter ex-wife, but inside the walls of Novus Kinetics, the atmosphere was electric. I was not driven by the need to destroy Julian anymore. That was too small a motivation. I was driven by the pure, unadulterated joy of engineering. I was finally building the battery I had designed in my head a decade ago, unencumbered by Julian's need for cost-cutting and aesthetic compromises. We developed the Phoenix Cell, a solid-state battery that was 30% lighter than the Thorne model and, crucially, chemically impossible to overheat. While we were building the future, the cracks in Julian's present began to show. A contact in the industry whispered to me about an incident at a Thorne Energy test site in Nevada. A rapid charging station had suffered a catastrophic failure during a stress test, resulting in a small explosion that destroyed a prototype vehicle. Julian, terrified of the merger falling through, had immediately buried the accident. He paid off the testing crew and falsified the reports, claiming it was a software glitch rather than a hardware failure. He was using money to patch holes in a sinking ship, hoping he could sell it before the water reached his neck. The reveal came at Tech Summit in San Francisco. Thorn Energy had a massive booth with flashing lights and models in tight suits. Novus Kinetics had a simple black table and a live demonstration unit. When I took the stage, the room was skeptical. But then I ran the live comparison. I subjected the Phoenix cell to heat and pressure that would have turned a Thorn battery into a bomb. My battery remained stable, its output steady. The silence in the auditorium was broken by a single person clapping, then another, until the applause was a roar. By the time I walked off the stage, Thorn Energy stock had dropped 7% in after-hours trading. The market had seen the difference between a marketing gimmick and a technological revolution. The investors were beginning to realize that Julian was selling a pager in the age of the smartphone. That evening, I did not pop champagne. Instead, I sent a private courier to the hotel suite of the CEO of Omnicorp, the company about to buy Thorn Energy. The package contained a tablet with our test data and a simple handwritten note. It said, "Do not buy an empty shell. The engine belongs to me." I was no longer asking for a seat at the table. I was flipping the table over. The countdown to the Omnicorp merger was ticking away like a bomb, and the silence from the Thorn family was replaced by a frantic, suffocating pressure. They were hemorrhaging money trying to keep the stock price afloat while I was publicly dismantling their technical credibility. It was only a matter of time before they made a move. But I did not expect the patriarch himself to walk onto the concrete floor of my factory. Alistair Thorn arrived at Novus Kinetics on a rainy Tuesday morning. He looked entirely out of place amidst the welding sparks and the hum of machinery, his cashmere coat protecting him from the grit of the Navy Yard. He walked into my glass-walled office without knocking and dismissed his bodyguards with a wave of his hand. He did not sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the gray river, projecting the aura of a man who was used to bending the world to his will. He placed a single check on my desk. It was signed, but the amount line was left blank. "Fill it in," Alistair said, his voice low and gravelly, the tone of a mob boss making an offer that could not be refused. "I do not care how many zeros you write. Alara, put a price on the protocol, sign the transfer papers, and disappear. Go to Paris. Go to Tokyo. Just go away." I looked at the check. It represented more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. It was the easy way out. I picked it up, feeling the heavy, expensive paper between my fingers. Alistair watched me with a smug expectation, convinced that everyone had a price. I met his gaze, my eyes cold and steady, and slowly tore the check down the middle. Then I tore it again, dropping the confetti into the recycling bin. "You once told me at a dinner party that business is ruthless and sentiment is a weakness," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You taught me that lesson, Alistair, and I am learning it very well. I do not want your money. I want to see the look on your face when the world realizes you are selling them a hollow shell." Alistair's face turned a dangerous shade of red. He did not scream. He simply buttoned his coat, gave me a look of pure venom, and walked out. "You have made a grave mistake, girl," he whispered as he left. He was right, but not in the way he thought. That night, the desperation of the Thorn family turned criminal. At 3 a.m, the security alarms on our private servers triggered a silent alert. Someone was trying to brute force their way into our database. They were not looking for customer data. They were hunting for the chemical blueprints of the Phoenix cell. I sat in the server room with my lead programmer, watching the lines of code scroll across the monitors. Julian had hired professionals, likely a black hat group from Eastern Europe, to steal what he could not buy. But I had anticipated this. I knew Julian was a cheater at heart. Months ago, I had built a honeypot, a decoy server that looked exactly like our main database but contained gigabytes of flawed, useless data. We watched as the hackers took the bait. They bypassed the fake firewalls and downloaded the dummy files, thinking they had struck gold. But as they extracted the data, they unknowingly triggered a tracer program I had embedded in the files. It was a digital die pack. "Got them," my programmer said, pointing to the screen. The hackers had tried to route their connection through a dozen proxies, but the tracer pinged back a physical location for the command terminal. It wasn't in Russia or China. It was on the 42nd floor of the Thorn Tower in Manhattan. Specifically, it was the private IP address of Julian's executive office. Gideon Vale looked at the logs the next morning with the smile of a wolf who had just cornered a deer. "This is not just corporate espionage," Gideon said, stacking the evidence files. "This is a federal crime. We have the trace, the timestamps, and the motive. If we hand this to the FBI, Julian goes to prison." "Not yet," I said. "We hold it. It is the final nail," as if the universe was conspiring to accelerate their collapse. My phone buzzed that evening with an encrypted message. It was from a number I did not recognize, but the text was desperate. "We need to talk. He is lying to everyone about the money. Please." It was Serena. The woman who had worn diamonds on the stage while I was thrown out the back door was now reaching out to me. The alliance of the enemy was shattering from the inside, and she was the first rat looking for a lifeboat. I texted back a time and a location. The end game had begun. I met Serena in the back corner of a quiet tea house in Chelsea, far away from the paparazzi lenses that usually stalked her every move. She did not look like the triumphant queen who had taken my place on the stage at the Platinum Gala. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, and for the first time, I noticed that the diamond on her finger was missing. She did not order anything. She simply sat there, gripping her designer handbag as if it contained a bomb. "It is not a marriage. Ilara," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is a merger. My father's media company is drowning in debt. The Thorn family promised to bail us out in exchange for the positive press coverage I could provide and the social legitimacy of the union. It was a business transaction, pure and simple." I watched her, feeling a strange mix of pity and vindication. Julian had not replaced me with a soulmate. He had replaced me with another asset, one he was now failing to leverage. Serena reached into her bag and slid a heavy manila envelope across the table. "I cannot marry a man who is going to prison," she said. "I did some digging after you posted that white paper. This is the internal safety audit log for the last 24 months. I opened the envelope. Inside were printouts of emails and Excel spreadsheets that proved Thorn Energy had been systematically falsifying safety data for 2 years. They knew the batteries had a tendency to degrade rapidly under high heat, and instead of fixing the engineering, they had simply altered the numbers in the reports to pass regulatory inspection. It was not just negligence. It was fraud on a massive scale. I made her a promise right then and there. If she announced the end of the engagement before the lawsuit hit, I would leave her name out of the legal filings. She would be the woman who narrowly escaped a con artist, not an accomplice. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, and left the tea house without looking back. I took the documents straight to Gideon. When he saw the falsified safety reports, he actually whistled. "This is not just a lawsuit, Ilara," he said, grinning like a shark. "This is an execution. The next morning, we dropped the hammer." Gideon filed a massive lawsuit in the federal district court, charging Thorn Energy with copyright infringement regarding the Ether protocol and, more damningly, gross commercial fraud and endangering public safety. We included the hacked IP logs as proof of corporate espionage and the internal safety audits Serena had provided as proof of the cover-up. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The court granted an emergency injunction, freezing all assets of Thorn Energy and legally blocking the merger with Omnicorp until the investigation was complete. The news broke at 9 in the morning. By noon, it was the headline on every financial news network in the world. Thorn Energy shares went into freefall. The stock opened at $80 a share, and by lunch, it was trading at $12. Billions of dollars in market capitalization evaporated in 3 hours. The investors who had toasted Julian weeks ago were now frantically dumping their holdings, terrified of being associated with a company accused of faking safety data. But the final blow happened inside the Thorn boardroom. My source inside the building told me the details later. Alistair Thorn, the man who had taught his son to be ruthless, called an emergency board meeting. Julian walked in, expecting his father to bail him out, to use his connections to make the lawsuit disappear. Instead, Alistair stood at the head of the table, his face like stone. He did not look at his son with love or even pity. He looked at him as a liability. "The board has voted unanimously," Alistair said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You are suspended from your position as CEO, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." Julian tried to argue. He shouted that he was being set up, that he was the face of the company, but Alistair simply turned his back on him. The guards, the same men who had dragged me out of the gala months ago, stepped forward and stripped Julian of his badge. He was dragged out of his own empire, screaming, while the ticker on the wall showed his net worth hitting 0. The end of the Thorne dynasty did not happen with a bang, but with a fax. At 9 in the morning on a Monday, Omnicorp issued a press release stating they were formally terminating the acquisition of Thorne Energy due to material misrepresentations of asset value and safety data. In the same breath, they announced they had entered into exclusive negotiations with Novus Kinetics to license our Phoenix Cell technology for their next generation of electric vehicles. The market reaction was a bloodbath. Thorne Energy stock, already battered, flatlined. But the real devastation was personal. I learned through the financial grapevine that the Thorne family had leveraged themselves to the hilt. Anticipating the $5 billion payout, they had taken out massive bridge loans to purchase islands, yachts, and art. They had spent a fortune they did not yet have. Now, the banks were calling in those debts, and the collateral was evaporating. By Wednesday, the news broke that the bank had moved to foreclose on the Thorne family estate in the Hamptons. The stress was too much for the old lion. Alistair Thorne, the man who had threatened me with a blank check, suffered a mild stroke while shouting at a foreclosure agent in his driveway. He survived, but the image of the invincible patriarch being loaded into an ambulance signaled the true end of their era. Then came Julian. He did not call first. He simply appeared at the reception desk of Novus Kinetics on a rainy Friday afternoon. My assistant buzzed me, her voice confused, telling me that a man claiming to be my husband was in the lobby. I told her to let him in. When the elevator doors opened, I barely recognized him. The Julian Thorne I knew was a man of manicured perfection, a man who panicked if his tie was slightly crooked. The man standing before me wore a suit that looked like it had been slept in for 3 days. His face was covered in patchy stubble, and his eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark, bruised circles of exhaustion. He had lost everything. His wife had left him. His father was incapacitated. His fortune was gone, and his reputation was in tatters. He walked into my office and looked around at the exposed brick and the bustling activity on the factory floor below. It was the empire he should have built, but he had been too busy looking in the mirror. "Ilara," he said, his voice cracking. He sounded like a child. He didn't scream or threaten. He walked over to my desk and sank to his knees. It was a shocking, pathetic sight. The man who had once told me I was not worth the space I occupied was now kneeling on my floor, clutching the edge of my desk like a lifeline. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You have to help us. The banks are taking everything. My father, he will not survive the eviction. We have nothing left. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But for the sake of 10 years, Ilara, 10 years of marriage, please, buy the company. Save us." I looked down at him. I waited for the anger to rise. I waited for the satisfaction of revenge, the thrill of seeing my enemy defeated. But there was nothing, no hate, no love, no triumph. I felt as if I were looking at a stranger, a sad, broken man who had nothing to do with me. The fire that had fueled me for months had burned itself out, leaving only a clear, cold clarity. "Get up, Julian," I said softly. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "I will buy Thorne Energy," I said. I will cover the immediate debts to keep your father in a care facility. I will acquire the manufacturing plants and the infrastructure. Thank you, he sobbed, reaching for my hand. Thank you. Ilara, thank you. I pulled my hand away before he could touch me. Do not thank me, I said, my voice cutting through his relief. I am not doing this to save you. I am doing it because I need the factories to scale up my production. And there is one condition. He nodded frantically. Anything. The name, I said. The brand Thorn Energy ceases to exist the moment I sign the papers. The signs come down. The letterhead is burned. The legacy is erased. I am renaming the parent company. Renaming it to what? He asked, his voice trembling. I looked him dead in the eye. Vance Energy. He flinched as if I had slapped him. He knew exactly what that meant. It meant that history would record that the Thorn Empire was not just lost. It was conquered by the woman they had thrown out in the trash. He lowered his head, defeated, and nodded. He had no choice. He was selling his family name to survive. The press conference to announce the reverse acquisition was brief and brutal. I stood at the podium where Julian had once preened like a peacock and announced that Novus Kinetics had acquired all assets, intellectual property, and infrastructure of Thorn Energy for 12 cents on the dollar. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply stated the facts of the market. The Thorn Empire had collapsed under the weight of its own fraud, and I was the scavenger picking the bones clean to build something stronger. After the cameras turned off, I walked into the main boardroom to finalize the paperwork. The room smelled of stale coffee and defeat. Julian sat at the long mahogany table, flanked by his mother, Victoria. Alistair was absent, confined to a medical facility after his stroke, his signature provided by power of attorney. Victoria, the woman who had once called me a lab rat, refused to look at me. She stared at her hands, which were devoid of the heavy sapphire rings she used to wear. They had been sold weeks ago to pay legal fees. I sat at the head of the table. My lawyers slid the stack of documents toward the Thorn family. They signed in silence, their pens scratching against the paper like the sound of dirt hitting a coffin. When the last page was turned, I clasped my hands and looked at them. As the new owner of this entity, my first act of business is restructuring, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Effective immediately, the entire executive board is dissolved. This includes the position of CEO, CFO, and the honorary chairmanships held by the Thorn family. You are all terminated for cause, citing gross negligence and corporate malfeasance. There will be no severance packages. There will be no golden parachutes. You leave with what is in your pockets. Victoria let out a small, strangled sob. Julian looked up at me, his eyes red and desperate. He leaned forward, ignoring the restraining hand of his lawyer. Ilara, please, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know this is hard, but I know you still care. Somewhere in there, you still care about us. About me. We can work together. I can help you run the transition. Do not do this. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. The man before me was not a partner or a lover. He was just a bad investment. This is not personal, Julian, I replied, my tone flat and professional. This is just business, and to be frank, you are simply not qualified for the position. I pulled the final deed toward me. It was the document that officially transferred the naming rights of the headquarters. I took my pen, a heavy fountain pen I had bought with my first check from Marcus Kane, and signed my name with a flourish. Beside the signature line, I crossed out Thorn Tower and wrote Vance Tower in thick, black ink. I stood up and buttoned my blazer. Security will escort you out. You have 10 minutes to clear your personal effects. I walked out of the conference room without looking back. I could hear Julian calling my name, but his voice sounded distant, like a ghost haunting a house that no longer belonged to him. I walked past the receptionist, past the security guards who nodded respectfully at me, and stepped into the private elevator. I took the lift to the penthouse floor, the highest point in the city, The office that had once belonged to Alistair Thorne was now empty, stripped of its old colonial furniture. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at Manhattan. The city was a grid of golden lights, a vast electric organism that I now commanded. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. A notification from my bank flashed on the screen. The acquisition bonus and the new valuation of my equity had hit my account. The balance was a string of numbers that meant I would never have to worry about rent, or heating bills, or the price of groceries ever again. I possessed hundreds of millions of dollars. Below that was a text message from Serena. It was short. "Thank you. I am free." I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, recycled air of the summit. I looked at my wrist. I was still wearing the cheap plastic digital watch I had bought when I was living in the basement in Queens. It was scratched and ugly, a reminder of every second I had spent in the dark. I unclasped the watch and placed it on the empty window ledge. I did not need to know the time anymore. I owned the time. I turned away from the window and walked toward the door, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. I was Alara Vance, and my work was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment down below where you are listening from, as I would love to connect with you all and hear your thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people.